Good evening to all of you. Whether you're a member or friend of Naples United Church of Christ, or you stumbled across this discussion on live stream or Facebook Live, we are really glad you're here with us. My name is Deb Kaiser-Cross, and I serve as a minister for congregational care here at Naples United Church of Christ. And once again, I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues, Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who serves as the assistant minister, and Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who serves as our senior pastor. This is the fourth week of our Clergy Roundtable series based on the book Forgive to Live, How Forgiveness Can Save Your Life by Dr. Dick Tibbetts. Considering the events of this year, its challenges with the pandemic and our national climate, we thought a deep dive into the concept of forgiveness might be helpful for every one of us. The stresses of these past few months have taken a toll on all of us. And for many of us, our relationships with our families, friends, and even acquaintances have been challenged. I'm hoping that this look into the theme of forgiveness has been helpful for you thus far and will continue to be. I know it has been for me. I've really been stretched to look at my own life and to consider and practice deeper levels of forgiveness. The first week, we looked at what forgiveness is and what it isn't. We were then introduced to the 10 principles of forgiveness. Then our second week, Sharon helped us understand how we get stuck in unforgiveness with grievance stories. And then last week, Dawson led us in a discussion on how to choose forgiveness. And this evening, we're going to be focusing on how forgiveness helps us find peace in the present and hope for our future. But before we get started, I want to turn to Dawson for a few messages.
You know, as I mentioned last week, Deb, I know that you brought this book to the proverbial table because of a recommendation from a Stephen minister. And so, again, I'm so grateful for this conversation and for your collegiality, both of you, and for this conversation. And I think, and I just want to take a moment to say that, you know, we talked about this in the context of, you know, forgiveness is always a good thing to discuss. However, it felt like this year, you know, with especially social distancing and the things that we're going through, that perhaps we've had more time to sit and to reflect. But it also, I think we're particularly mindful, having come through just this week, one of the most, these are my words, one of the most contentious elections, perhaps the most contentious election in our nation's history. And as people of faith, no matter how you voted or how you identify party or candidates, current or in the past, you know, I think these are days in which we live that we will have a unique opportunity to practice forgiveness for things that have been said. Perhaps social media drives some of that. I know there's some signs that have been posted in my community that are actually against the HOA rules, but they still got put up that I know that many are going to be working through in the coming days and months. And so I think the principles of this book, we have an immediate opportunity to put into practice. So I know as a clergy team and as a congregation, we are holding our nation close in prayer during these days. And perhaps this is the perfect topic for us to be talking about. So again, thanks to you and to our Stephen ministry, and again, Sharon, thanks to you for all of us being a part of this, and as always, thanks to Brad, our director of production, and Wendy, who is always behind the scenes somewhere close by, making sure we all have it together. So I just want words of gratitude, but also words of, I think, how we incorporate and include this into our wider living.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity.
I just think it's so important, this topic, for all of us in this particular moment in time. So let's go ahead and get started. Yeah. And it's probably appropriate that we start with grievance stories.
Fair enough, yeah.
So One of the most powerful things that I've learned from Dr. Tibbetts is the power of the grievance story to keep us stuck in the past. Just a bit of review. A grievance story is a story that we tell ourselves about a situation in which we were hurt, placing the blame for the hurt on the other person. The way to move beyond a grievance story is to reframe it to include all the information about the other person you may not now know, recognizing that there are pieces of the story that may clash with my particular grievance story. Reframing our grievance stories allows us to move beyond blame and through to forgiveness to take charge of the outcome of the story. A grievance story only looks at the pain and the hurt. We focus on a single hurtful event. Based on that narrow perspective, we make generalizations about everything else. But if we place it in a larger frame, we see a much broader view of the world in that particular situation. Now, there are steps that we can take to changing that memory. So here's the first. Number one, we focus on what is true about the event from both your point of view and the offender's perspective. That's the hard part. Number two, empathy for the person who hurt you. Wow. Number three, identify the wrong you yourself have committed that may need forgiving. That is a really tough one for most of us because we'd rather blame the other person. Number four, revise your story so that it more accurately reflects the point of view of the offender as well as the offended. And five, look ahead at your goals, life goals, and take steps forward towards achieving them. And finally, number six, realize that forgiveness takes time. Forgiveness is almost never achieved in a single attempt. Wow. Okay. So as you had a chance to reflect on your own grievance stories this past week, either your own grievance story or ones that you've experienced, what is it that you have learned about grievance stories?
Well, one of the things that comes to my mind that I think is critical is this notion of developing empathy for the person who hurt you. And I think as a pastor, perhaps as pastors, we have an even greater awareness than many other people do about the fact that everybody has a story, and that many times we interact with people and we have no idea the story of their lives and the kinds of things that play into who they are at any given moment. And so that's part of that big picture is not just looking at that person at that moment and that behavior, but what do I know about this person? And I think that's just a really important reminder to not assume the intent, to not assume this. It tells us everything about that person, that there's so much more.
Yeah.
So that's an important lesson for me.
How about you, Dawson?
I think, I kept thinking as I was reading each of the steps, thinking, I'd read one and go, oh yeah, that's really hard. And then I'd read the next one and go, well, that's kind of hard too. One of the things I appreciated about Tibbetts' writing, especially in this section, was his own vulnerability about where he can, he talks about his ability as he learned from his father. And so it hit a little close to home about his ability to inflate a story. And I thought, and he says, it's not an attempt to lie, but an attempt to embellish and to tell a good story and things like that. But he said, it's a both and. It can be an enlarged story, which means the grievance piece of it can be enlarged, but it's also an attempt to tell a good story, things like that. And that really resonated with me about in telling a good story that can grow and grow and grow, it also means the grievance can grow and grow and grow. It can start with, they frustrated me or I was upset with them or whatever, but then it can if you embellish or if the story becomes bigger and bigger, as does the grievance. And so I just thought about how even in our casual conversations, how that can completely change as you retell or recount your grievance story.
And for me, what I really learned about myself is how often I paint the other person as having all the blame.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that I'm taking more blame than I think I need to, but I'm more open-minded about looking at what I did to contribute to this situation. Maybe not in that moment, but in everything that preceded it. That, for example, I had a really difficult relationship with someone, and when I started looking back to how it happened, it's because I didn't address some issues that had been going on early in the relationship, and then it created more and more distance until the break happened. And so when I look back at it, I thought, if I had just addressed those things with her along the way, I would not have gotten to that point where I had the grievance story. And so that was the real learning for me in this. And so I guess this is not one of your questions, so I'm going to surprise you with this. Which is the one you get stuck on? Where do you tend to get stuck here on grievance stories?
I think for me, it's probably the fourth. Revise your story so that it more accurately reflects the point of view of the offender as well as the offended. Because a good, juicy grievance story, there's really only one party that's been offended.
Right.
And it's all the blame is on the other person. And so, I think for me, I can really get caught in a loop there.
Yeah, I hear you.
And I was going to say that too, but for slightly different reason.
Okay.
Because I really pick up on the word accurately.
Oh, interesting.
Because I think as human beings, we have a very hard time seeing ourselves accurately, maybe even seeing other people accurately. And I come at this, in part, there's this little, educational psychologist piece of my mind, but perception is not reality, and we perceive things as we perceive them, and to say to ourselves, the way I see this may not be accurate. How do I get accurate information? It's difficult, not just emotionally, but even cognitively, to really get hold of what's the reality, what's the accurate picture.
That's good. And for me, I think what happens is that I get what I think is a grievance from someone, and then I tend to talk to other people about it, a few people, and let them help me create a bigger grievance story. Yeah. And then I start ruminating. So if I could stop early on and try a different way of doing it, I think venting is fine. I vent to one other person or two other people, but then just sort of have a reality check and say, okay, let's look at this a little more carefully instead of continuing to do that. That's where I get stuck. So, any other comments on grievance stories?
Yeah, I was just going to ask your opinion of, it seems to me a good grievance story that gets, told and embellished and then can grow. It seems to me like there's a narcissistic side to a grievance story, because if it becomes all about you and not about the other person or the other party, or, that particularly those who, again, get caught up in that narrative, that's really where that potentially has some psychological impacts. You're the one with the training on that. Would you disagree with that? Do you think, No,
I think anybody, we're talking now the difference between being a little narcissistic, which is most humans are,
right,
and then like narcissistic personality disorder.
Fair enough, yeah.
people with narcissistic personality disorder are going to do this all the time.
Yeah.
It's always about them.
Yeah, this will be their narrative. Yeah.
And it will happen over and over and over. But I think the human condition is that we all do a little bit of it.
Sure.
I think maybe it's an issue of degrees.
Sure.
That the more self-reflective we become, hopefully with spiritual maturity and emotional maturity, the less we do it. I just wish I'd learned it about 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, trust me, yeah.
Well, I just want to add, Dawson, you're talking about embellishing it and it becomes bigger and all of that. I thought about this notion of repeating and ruminating in a slightly different way, that it's not just that it becomes bigger, but it becomes more entrenched.
Yes.
I mean, if you think of spinning your wheels, you know, and the rut gets deeper and deeper, that whether it's bigger or it's just the same, you just get stuck. It's harder to get out of it when you have repeated it so many times. So it's, I mean, both are bad. It's just slightly different angle on.
And it is like, I've always heard the expression, it's like the old wagon wheels in the West. If you've ever been out West, you can still see wagon wheel tracks in some parts of our country. It's because they're so entrenched, they've been in there for such a long time that it lasts. And so it's the same thing. It's the wagon wheels of our brain with this story over and over, and we're just keeping it there.
Well, I think too about what you were saying about, you know, you gather some friends around or some family or a combination thereof, you tell that story, and that helps that entrenchment, that helps that embellishment. And so it, you know, that grievance story becomes a part of your narrative. I mean, that's just a part of who you are, because those closest to you and those around you begin to realize that is your story. That is who you are, or you become associated with that. So I think that's part of how that story lives on.
Well, I mean, we could talk a
Oh, yeah.
lot more about grievance stories because apparently that all resonated with us.
Yes.
And hopefully for you too. But you know, let's talk about the next section, which is chapter 9, on forgiving and finding peace in the present. So this whole chapter is about, yeah, we've got our grievance stories. Yes, we've been in situations where we need to forgive other people, but how can we find peace in our present time? So let's talk about that a little bit. He starts with this great quote, said, "Contentment blossoms when what you have in the present overshadows what you lack from the past, as well as what you want in the future. Conversely, dissatisfaction fills your mind when you continually think about all the reasons for your discontent." Ooh. So I guess I'd start with, what do you think of that one?
It's deep. I mean, I just remember, I mean, I think what resonated with me was when you continually think about all the reasons for your discontent. I mean, I just thought to myself, sure, I mean, if that's what you're going to dwell on, that's who you're going to become. I mean, what's the adage? What you give energy to grows. You know, and so if that's what you're giving energy to, that's what's going to grow. That's who you're going to become.
And not even about forgiveness for me. That is the struggle in the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Because, you know, I can't tell you how many times I wake up in the morning thinking, oh, you know, having a hard time looking forward to things, being discontented, and just how important this spiritual practice of gratitude is. Well, we can talk about that in a second. But how easy it is to just shift into discontentment.
Yeah.
How about you?
Well, I guess I was focusing on the question, how do you define contentment? So I'm trying to go to the positive. For me, the word that just came to mind was satisfaction. I mean, that it's okay. And we've talked sometimes amongst ourselves about the concept of enoughness, that it is enough. And you did a wonderful devotional about it being enough. But also not too long ago, in one of our staff team meetings, we were talking about, do we think about the past or the future? And a person who's much younger than I am said, well, I used to think about things in the past and, what if I'd done something differently and that kind of thing. And I don't do that so much. And I thought, and wait till you're 20 years older than you are now. Because I find with age, I'm more content. That there were times earlier in my life when, well, this wasn't the trajectory I anticipated. This wasn't the way I thought things might work out, and about this or that or the other thing. And at this point, I just feel more satisfied that, yeah, it was a different journey than I anticipated, but it's been a good journey, and I don't look back with regret at the past. And so, to me, things that used to bother me don't seem so important. To go to your point about the pandemic, well, I'll let you get there. I'll let you say
I'm
other
just curious,
things.
do you think that contentment, do you believe that you've actively worked at that, or do you think it has more naturally come with the aging process?
It's probably both.
Okay.
It's both in the terms of what Deb just mentioned about practicing gratitude and remembering to be self-aware and think about how much I have to be grateful for.
Yeah.
And so there is that, but there is also just a sense of little things that seem so big don't seem so big anymore.
Yeah.
And some of that, I'm just having this thought this minute, but some of that's the same idea of reframing it in the big picture.
Sure.
When you're 20, the picture is small and each little thing is magnified. When you're more than 3 times that, then it's just reframed. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
Well, I really appreciate that because I like your definition of satisfaction and it is enough. But I also really like your perspective on not as much regret about the past. And I think you're right because what I've noticed is that some of the things that I had a hard time forgiving myself for were decisions I made that took me to a place I didn't think were good places. I chose to stay in a situation or relationship that I didn't think was a healthy one. But now I look back on it and I say, you know what? I have learned so much from that. It has made me who I am today. And so it's that larger perspective, the things that may have seemed like wrong turns at the moment, were just meandering through life to help me become the person I am today.
Yeah. I remember once hearing someone talk about, well, if that's a bad decision or a bad direction, they were kind of in this crossroads, then, I'll go this way, and if that's not the right way, then I'll back up. And I remember a friend saying, why do you have to back up? You just keep going and change directions. But, there's no need to back up and start over. Rather, you just go in a different direction because that's really life's way of handling things. And I just remember thinking, oh, yeah, that does make a lot of sense.
I mean, he talks about gratitude being a very important practice, and we all know that. But I thought I might ask you, what is your own practice of gratitude? How do you do that? Everybody does it differently. Anybody?
For me, it has to be an intentional inventory practice. Usually writing things down, naming them aloud. There are ways, and there are times in which I know I need to do it. Yeah. When it feels like I'm a little out of balance with, feeling discontented versus satisfied. And so it's like, okay, let's back up and take a deep breath here.
I don't think I have such a formal practice. It's an informal, but it's remembering at different times of the day to stop. And it's also trying to notice the little things and to be grateful for the little things, whether it's the red-headed woodpecker that was in the magnolia tree the other day, or it's the FaceTime from our granddaughter who's on doing Zoom school, but when she gets her work done in between, she sometimes calls and chats. And just remembering how much the little things do mean and how much difference they make.
It sounds like it's just paying attention for you. I love that we're all so different in how we practice it, and we probably represent the congregation. I have a journal that I just love because it forces me every single day to look at the things that gave me joy the day before, 3 things, and on the other side of the page, it's 3 things that I'm grateful for. And I push myself never to repeat, which is very difficult, very difficult. So it makes it very specific. And I need the structure because that's just my personality, and I'm a journaler. So the different varieties, I think people need to see that there's a lot of ways to do it, but it's still critical in our lives. So, okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. I really appreciated his analogy about the thoughts in our minds being like TV channels. He asserted that when we find ourselves hyper-focused and ruminating on something negative, like the wrongs that we may have experienced, we have the capacity to change the channel. We each hold a remote control in our hands, and we can stay on that channel or we can change it. For me, it's a little like watching the news. After a while, I ask myself, how much negative news do I want to consume today? And if I have had enough, I change the channel. I can do the same thing with the things that get stuck in my mind. So if you're comfortable sharing this, what's your own internal default channel?
As I had to try to think about it, what I realized is, and this is not something I'm proud of, but it's my to-do list.
Oh.
That when I'm not consciously thinking about something else, then I go to, okay, what is it that needs to be done, and when does it need to be done, and how am I going to get it done? And it takes work to change that channel and do something different.
Do you find you're doing that, especially when you don't like what's going on in your mind?
Change the channel when I don't like what's going on in my mind,
Yeah,
or go
like-
to my to-do list? I'm not sure
Well,
I get the question.
Because what he was talking about is, when you tend to be ruminating about something negative, what do you, do you do it then? Go to your to-do list?
No, I just think that's the default
You just do it all the time.
default channel.
It doesn't matter. It could be
Right.
positive. It could be negative.
Yeah.
I got it.
But what I was thinking about when you talk about I really also like the analogy, and not thinking so much in terms of the default, but that this is one of the reasons that it is so important that we live into the fullness of our lives in terms of being well-rounded and having relationships and having things that we find purpose in, because to change the channel, you have to have another channel.
We're going to get there in a minute.
I mean, that's the thing. The people I worry about in the pandemic are people who don't have any other channel that they can identify. And that, so I'll let you get there, but
We're going to get there in a second.
Yeah, I think the default channel that I tend to rest on is what I call the oughts and shoulds. What ought I, what should I be doing, and what is expected of me, and things like that. And so if I find my brain going in a direction that or my thinking in a direction that I'm not comfortable with, I come back to that ought and should, because that's what I think, because that's manageable, because I understand it, because that's what's playing in my head. And so although that's not necessarily the healthiest or most helpful, it's really about it is the default. It's what I know often so best.
And I think I would say I have a couple of channels, I think. One is that whole, the to-do. I mean, you raised something, I hadn't thought of that, is that when I'm uncomfortable, especially in these days where I feel helpless about a lot of choices, because we don't have a lot of choices like we did before, I find myself going to, well, what can I control? What can I control in my life? And so what I can control is I could make a phone call. I could do this for work. I could be positive about this. I could go on a bike ride. Like, I go to what I can control.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's true all the time, but for right now, that seems to be my default.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we're going to go back to what Sharon was talking about. He tells them about an interesting exercise he does with people. He says who are stuck in a particular situation and can't seem to get off of it. He talked about imagining a freshly picked lemon. Okay? So I want you to notice what you see, what you smell, what you notice about it, and then taste it in your mind. Okay? And you hold that picture for, 15 seconds. Then he tells them, forget the lemon. Forget it. Just stop thinking about it. And the person realizes they can't forget the lemon. The more the person is told not to think about the lemon, the more think about it. But then he suggests, think about a freshly picked apple from an orchard in the fall. He asks them to imagine biting into it, smelling it, tasting it, enjoying it. What happened to thinking about lemon in that moment? It's gone. We have a choice about where our mind gets focused. And so he spends a great amount of time asserting that changing our thoughts can lead to changing our feelings. What do you think about that?
I just had this vision of my niece, Riley, oldest niece, who, when she was little, we would be in a restaurant and they put lemons out on the table, especially if you're drinking iced tea, and she would bite into them, and she clearly liked the taste, but she would make that face. And so when I was reading this part, that was all I could think of was Catherine Wright's face. But I think he raises such a good point here, is those experiences that if you want to call lemon experiences in our lives, it doesn't always, it's not always very easy to just let them go or to stop thinking about them. And I think one of the things that I took away from this part of the book was we do have to figure out for ourselves what it is that will help us or move us beyond that. You have to figure out what the apple moment is for you. And I think for each of us, it's likely very different. But it is very difficult, often very difficult, to move past that sour experience.
Yeah, it is.
I think I certainly agree with him that our thoughts can change our feelings. And I don't think I always believed that's been a maturing thing, that certainly in a stubborn younger youth, if I felt a certain way, that's the way it was, and you better deal with the way I feel. And with the help of friends and counselors along the way, I've learned that I can rename things, and that I can make choices about how I identify my feelings, and that does, it can make a difference.
It can.
And so, yeah, he had, charts and different ways that it could happen, but I certainly think, and it goes back because he also talked about just the mind-body connection, that how we think about things does affect how we feel. And certainly if I get stuck in a poor me way of thinking, then I'm going to feel things differently than if I feel like I'm an adult who has some control and can make some choices. And he certainly talks a lot about we do have choices.
We do. When I was a young therapist in training, I remember studying the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, and I was young, and I was like, oh, that is so simplistic. That doesn't make any sense to me. You can't change your feelings by just changing your thoughts. But the older I get, the more I realize it doesn't always work, but it can. And I was thinking about, I was in this really kind of negative place last week. It was just a really hard week for whatever reason. We have those times. And I realized that I had had a really beautiful moment with my granddaughter, who had just called and wanted to, she was saying, yuck it, Nana. She wanted me to see something. And I was able to say, I can choose to do this, or I can remember Avery's face saying, yuck it, Nana. And it really did shift me, but I had to keep doing it because it was easy to go back into the default of it all. And so I do think it has the capacity. Also, I find that when I have limiting beliefs about my abilities or anything, then it leads to not enoughness feelings, and then it leads to inaction. So there is, for me, that process. It's mind, body. It's mind, spirit too. That I just need to be really aware of my thoughts, because they do really impact my feelings and actions.
Well, and I just was thinking as you were mentioning that sometimes I think it means you have to eat more apples.
Yeah.
To really, before you get that lemon taste out of your mouth. I mean, because I'm just thinking about your example about time with Avery, that, I have those moments remotely, especially in the times we're living in, and it really does take some time to, really soak those in, because it can be very fleeting, but it can be very meaningful.
Especially when we revisit that, ruminate on that,
Right.
instead of whatever it is we were ruminating on that was
Exactly.
the lemon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So in this chapter, Dr. Tibbetts suggests a few practices that can help us move into a more peaceful place, which can help facilitate forgiveness too. Because most of us can only get to forgiveness when we're not emotionally riled up. So he said, first of all, take a breath break, taking some deep breaths, slowly counting to 5 on the inhale and counting to 5 on the exhale. I'll also say there's therapists who will say you do 4, you hold it for 7, and you let it out for 8, especially when it's a really intense feeling. So you could do it either way. You do it over and over until a sense of peace comes to you. So that's first about deep breaths. Second,
I want peace.
I know,
That's
right?
always the image I have. Those kinds of situations.
I
yeah.
know. And then there's also progressive muscle relaxation. Well, I've done that in a yoga class, which
Right.
is fabulous.
Yeah.
I don't do it often enough, but that's where you tighten and loosen every single muscle group in your body. And you start often with your toes, and then you go up to your head, because a lot of us carry most of our stress around here. And then you just progressively relax. It takes more time. And then the other thing that he suggested, which I don't do but was interesting, using light, aroma, and color to create a more peaceful environment. So, have you tried any of those practices, and what was your experience?
Well, what I wrote down is I miss yoga. I really need to do yoga. And I know if I could do it on Netflix if I would just remember, but it's a whole lot easier if I have a class that Shannon is doing, and I miss that. It's interesting because I have done various different things to relax and calm myself. I've never made the connection to that and forgiveness.
I know.
But I do know, I just came, as I was thinking about this, like, I know that in the hour before dinner, kids and adults are cranky. I know that if I am too tired at night, I am not my best self. And so part of what I have learned is when I have work to do, I haven't thought about it in terms of forgiveness, but just work to do with another person, not to do it when I'm cranky or exhausted.
Right.
I mean, and so the principle of getting myself at peace to do that makes sense. I've just never made that specific connection to forgiveness.
Yeah, yeah.
For me, light and smell are very powerful. And so, kind of like you were saying, right before dinner, for me in the evening, to try to kind of let the end of the day to begin to try to unwind or let go of the day. It's not uncommon, even if I'm still watching television or something like that, but to turn lights off and to light a candle. Mm-hmm. And so the light of that candle for me is a very spiritual thing, but also the smell, because it to me it changes how the room feels, and so I can always tell a difference for that.
I think for me, it's definitely the breathing piece. Yoga is wonderful for me too, but again, I don't do it often enough. I wish I did. But it's the breathing, and it helps mostly with anxiety when I'm overstressed. And like you, I try really hard not to have any discussions of significance in the evening because it's not my best time. That David and I learned early in our marriage, don't have any significant conversations past about 7 o'clock because this is not going to be pretty.
Right. No.
But I would say the breathing, but I think my growing edge is really going to be scent, because we do have candles all over the house, and I so rarely light them. I don't know why, but I think I would really like to try that to sort of create an atmosphere.
Well, for me, one of the fun things has become, because that is important to me, is it becomes almost a spiritual practice of seeking out a candle, because I have one candle that I keep in my den area, because that's often, if I'm at home, it's where I write, that's where I relax. And so it becomes a finding the right something. For that space. And so it's just kind of a fun little.
That's a good one. I think it's he just gave me some more options, which is great. Yeah. So let's see. I guess the last question before we switch to the last chapter is, how do you think a peaceful spirit could help with your forgiveness practice?
I think to be genuine in your desire to forgive and to be in right relationship requires that you be at peace with yourself. I don't see in my own life how I can be unsettled, truly unsettled, and able to offer forgiveness to either another person or a group of people or things like that. And so I have to be right with myself before I can be right with others, and being right with myself also means right with God.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely true, and I think one of the points he makes throughout the book is the importance of timing, that you choose the time that in next week talk some things about not forgiving too quickly, but it's got to be at the right time, and that may take time to get there, and that's okay. I mean, there's a lot of, there's a very accepting feeling about the book, about you're not going to do it perfect every time, if ever. There isn't a right time for everybody. I mean, that there's a lot of guidance, but there's also a sense of you're going to have to find your own way, and that's okay.
That's true. So let's segue into the last chapter for today, or this evening. And it's chapter 10, Forgiving and Finding Hope for the Future. So he began the chapter with this quote: "Nobody can go back and start a new beginning, but anyone can start today and make a new ending." And then he goes on to tell the story about Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And after he had completed his work of serving as the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a group formed to investigate the gross human rights violations committed during the era of apartheid in South Africa, he said, "There can be no future without forgiveness." South Africa had been deeply divided by racism for decades, if not centuries. And after blacks had finally won the right to vote in 1993, many feared that widespread violence and riots would follow. Yet with the wise leadership of Tutu and others, something different unfolded. They were all wrestling with the question, how could this nation come to a place of healing where there might be a future for everyone? Tutu answered that question with a single word: forgiveness. He believed it would be only through forgiveness that the people of South Africa could forge a hopeful future. Forgiveness says we are going to move forward from what was toward what can be. Forgiveness allows the wounded to let go of their yesterdays in order to build their tomorrows. So the question is, while we know that the story in South Africa did not always lead to positive outcomes, there was great healing for many in the process of truth and reconciliation. And of course, it brought me to the great divisions, deep divisions that live among us in our nation today. What do you think we could learn from South Africa's experience with forgiveness with our friends, our neighbors, our family, or groups that we interact with in our culture that may be different from our own?
First of all,
Big question, I know.
Yeah, I know. First of all, I would commend Tutu wrote a book entitled "No Future Without Forgiveness," and it is a very powerful read. It's actually a relatively short read, so I would, and it chronicles in a shorter way some of the work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I would commend it to anyone to read. You know, and I think the story of South Africa is so interesting as they rebuilt their government because, for instance, South Africa, I believe, was the first nation to incorporate into their constitution, their new constitution post-1993, marriage equality and things like this, because what they said was, we are tired of being a nation that excludes and we want to be a nation that includes, you know, and so they did some really, for the time and place of where they were, some really radical things. And so again, I just hold it up as a really fascinating study. Again, as you point out, Deb, not everything perfect, and certainly not perfect today. It's still very difficult economic and now environmental issues with water scarcity and things like that. But I think what we today can learn is also something that President Mandela taught, which was when he got out of prison, there were so many people who wanted revenge.
Yeah.
You know, and there's a powerful scene, and I'm trying to remember all the circumstances around it, but he literally told the young protesters to go throw their weapons in the ocean and to find a new way. And I just think about that as such a powerful lesson for those young people, a powerful lesson for us to say, this is not the way, you know, and that we have to find a new way. And so that can be, for me, that can be small and forgiving a friend, a loved one, things like that. Or on the corporate scale, again, having just come through an election, things like that. There's a better way.
Not focusing on vengeance.
Right. Yeah, not focusing on vengeance, not focusing on violence,
Yeah.
which unfortunately we've, as a nation, have turned to so much this year.
Yeah, I don't have an answer.
It's a tough question.
I'm anxious about the future. And I think the thing that I keep coming back to in terms of even South Africa is that they were able to do this when they got the right to vote, when some rights were restored. And I think for people who for blacks in this country, until there is some more justice, I can't ask them to just forgive, forget it and move on. And we know forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. But I think that we need to be taking better care of one another. I mean, the rights that the LGBTQ community have had are threatened. The anti-Semitism has been on the rise. I mean, I just think we need to reach the point where some things are more just before we can just forgive. I mean, can't just forgive the injustices. So I don't know how all that happens. I think what I hold on to in terms of hope is, and this is very aspirational, but I think the church has something to offer to the world that requires justice. That is what God asks of us. But also to love mercy and certainly to forgive 7 times 7. So I think the church has a message and a power that we need to bring to bear to help reach that point where things are where there's greater justice, and then to work on some of the bigger issues of forgiveness. But I mean, the church has its own divisions to work through too. So it's if I were not a person of faith, I'd have less hope. I mean,
I think that's such an important statement, and pardon my interruption. I'm really struck by that, so thank you. But yeah, I worry and wonder about those without faith, or those whose faith is being deeply challenged, about where do they find hope. Yeah.
I'm gonna go a little bit different direction, because I don't feel I have the power to change a lot of things. I do have the power to change some things. And so what I'm responsible for in this is to be a person who's committed to forgiveness and reconciliation in my relationships, close relationships, and even ones that are a little bit removed, and not participate in grievance stories to the degree I've done it in the past. And that has to do with my particular situation is people who have shared perspectives in this election cycle that I do not share, is to not relegate them to the outer circles of darkness in my mind.
Right.
Because I think that's our tendency these days. It's like here or there. There's nothing in between. And I really am trying very hard to put the people with whom I've disagreed in this, I'm trying to see it in a larger perspective and try to understand where they're coming from. And so that's my piece in it. Not that I'm not aspirational and hope that the church can do wonders in this world, and I still hope we can, but it's harder.
Oh, yeah.
Am I the only one who struggles with, in those scenarios that you eloquently raised, Deb? I struggle sometimes with taking those things personally. People who, again, like I talk about the signs that have shown up in my neighborhood. I know, Sharon, you and I talked about that one-on-one. But, people who I don't know flying a flag or displaying a sign that I don't agree with, and somehow I can take that personally. And so I think to myself, there's nothing personal there. But again, I think it is about that deep breathing. It's about being in the right relationship with yourself and with God. It is about, I don't even know that they need, quote, forgiveness, but I do think it is about right relationship.
And I also think it's about not choosing to create a grievance story over it.
Yeah, thank you.
That's what I have the
that's a
power
much
to
better
do.
way. Yeah,
Yes.
That's really much better. Thank you. It's not about creating a grievance story that's frankly not there.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Making assumptions. And so for me, it's about small steps, and that's my perspective, because we're all different and we all offer so much. But that's the only small step I know I can make today, my next right step.
Yeah, especially in these times.
In these times.
Well, and I think probably that's why it's important that there are multiple points of view, because in terms of my daily life, I'm where you are. I can only operate at the individual level, or at the local level, or something. I have no desire to have elected roles and be part of the solution that way. But the question was asked broadly, so I answered broadly.
No, but I like that we have different perspectives here.
I do too.
No, I
And
think it's important because I mean, especially with the congregation our size, I think, as what's the great saying, where two or more gathered, there are at least 5 opinions. And so, I mean, I think.
thought they only said that about Baptists.
Yeah. But, I think it is important that there are a variety of opinions that, because I think we reflect more broadly the depth and the diversity of our congregation and others.
And I may have to make an aside to say that I was a Baptist, so I'm allowed to
Oh,
say
yeah,
that.
for those who may not remember, yeah.
I'm not castigating the other. That was me.
Right,
so.
exactly.
I hear you. We have gotten so immersed in this that we are kind of running out of time for the rest of the chapter. So I'm going to pick and choose and hope that the rest of you read about the power of optimism and hope in all of this. But I do want to ask this question. He spent a lot of time in this chapter on goal setting and as a way of creating a positive future. And I am a big goal setter. I love to do it. In this time, it's a challenge because everything changes from day to day. And I was also thinking about all the retired people in our congregation that I meet to talk with all the time, how they've decided to let go of that incessant need to create goals because they kind of left that aside in their careers. But I do think that without any set of goals, we kind of have a lack of purpose for the future in our lives and a lack of meaning in retirement. So what kinds of goals do you think might be important to consider for those in our midst who are retired? Like what?
I think it's still really important, and it's it probably takes work for many of us to take goal out of career. I mean, to separate them, but I think to make it, if you want to call it a goal, a purpose, to maintain relationship to other people, whether that's your family, whether that's the neighbors down the hall you need to be checking on and maintaining a relationship to. Having someone or something else that you're involved in caring for. There was a fascinating study many years ago of people in nursing homes, and if they gave them a plant, that they were responsible to take care of, they did better because they had something that they needed to do and something that depended on their care. And I think lots of people have pets who that's somebody to care for. I think I have had a lot of been blessed in my life with a lot of role models of people well into their 70s and 80s and 90s who were still reading and learning about the world and still engaged. So, a goal of continuing to learn. And I definitely think if at any age, if you don't have some of those personal kinds of goals that aren't about your career, that it's just harder, and it's harder in the pandemic because, like you said, what other channel do you go to if you don't have some of those other things?
Yeah.
I think one of the things that always amazes me and that I adore about so many in our congregation is how many in our congregation give back in some way and the volume in which they give back. So, from tutoring to mentoring to serving on boards to nonprofit boards to, Habitat, building homes, reading at Grace Place, teaching mothers where English is not the first language, teaching them English. The list goes on and on and on. And those are just the things we know about. Yeah. I can only imagine the things we don't even know about. And so I think to never stop giving back at some level. Because I think about even in some of the ministries here where it's addressing envelopes for people who's are turning 80 or older, where people say, well, I just don't do that much. That makes a tremendous difference in someone's life to know that their church not only remembers their birthday, but is celebrating alongside them. And, and that makes things like that really possible and feasible. And so I'm always amazed at that. So I think continuing to give back.
It's interesting. Well, you all know that David just retired. And so we've had a lot of conversations.
Yeah, what is he doing?
I know. We've had a lot of conversations about what it means to have a positive retirement. And one of the things that he decided to do is reach out to somebody he thought who did retirement really well. Yeah. And to talk with him on a regular basis about how to create a retirement. And it prompted me to reach out to two people I know who I thought did retirement really well and ask them their advice. And it included learning, giving back, enjoying the small moments, appreciating your spouse or partner or family. It was all these different things, and then, things not to do, which is things like overprogram.
Yeah, exactly.
Like just replicate your work life.
Yeah.
But I think that you've all identified some things, but I think the critical factor is creating meaning in retirement. And those are the kind of goals, because at the end of our lives, those kind of things are the things that we're going to look back on and say, that mattered. Yeah. So,
and the thing I would add to that is I do think it takes personal initiative. Because now you don't have a boss telling you that you got to do X, Y, Z. And I retired 4.5 years ago, and people ask me, so what are you going to do? I said, I don't know, but I'm not worried about it. But when we moved here, I was very intentional. I was not going to sit in my house and wait for friends to show up at my door. That I'd been on the school board. I cared about school board. I found out about school board issues and elections here. There were other things that I got involved in, which have led to a variety of things that I do in addition to being at the church. But you can't just sit home and expect it to happen. You have to take the initiative.
So I'm gonna cut because I'm the timekeeper today, and I know we're a little over already. So let me just say we've covered a lot of things this evening, and I pray that you will take away at least one thing that you might think about in a new way or a change that you may want to make in your life. This book has made us all think in new ways, and I hope it's done the same thing for you. So let me leave you with these words of challenge from Marvin Ashton. He said, "Be the one who nurtures and builds. Be the one who has a forgiving heart. Be the one who looks for the best in people. Leave people better than you found them." Have a great week.